Fatty meat, ribeye steak, oh my God, it's heaven. When you realize you can eat it with joy and know that it's the healthiest thing for you.
But people want to hear that, so that's why people are gravitating to you. You're charismatic, and you're telling people that their favorite foods that are rich in butter and high in animal protein that they thought were unhealthy, all of a sudden they're healthy.
Prove it.
People don't really want to eat salads, I think.
Two passionate experts, Simon Hill and Dr. Robert Kiltz, have recently debated nutrition on the Ellen Fisher podcast.
I have a problem with this idea of not trusting the science, but then thinking people on social media are somehow going to do a better job at getting to the truth.
Simon Hill is a physiotherapist and nutrition scientist and host of the Proof podcast. For the best-selling book, The Proof is in the Plants.
Increasing fiber and whole grain intake. Across the board, unanimous. 135 million plus people with follow-up data shows a reduction in risk of colorectal cancer. Why does that data exist, yet you take a different position?
Dr. Robert Kiltz is a diplomat of the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology. He is the founder of CNY Fertility and a thought leader in the keto carnivore movement.
As I look more and more at poisoning from plants, I believe that they're probably the leading cause of most of our diseases.
So you think fiber is
bad for you? It's absolutely bad. Fiber is one of the leading causes of colon cancer, and I'll bet $1 billion on it.
We're going to discuss our thoughts on this debate, but let's have a look at what they were debating.
The cause of disease in science and medicine seems to be multifactorial, idiopathic, uncertain. But we can agree that sugars are probably part of the problem, refined sugars more so than others. I do believe that plants are basically carbohydrates, all plants. It doesn't matter if you're a potato, tomato, or kale, or spinach, because they all break down to simple sugars in the gut. And my sister died of diabetes. She had it since age 4. The question is, why did she get it? And that's the mystery. As I look more and more at the plants and poisoning from plants, I believe that they're probably the leading cause of most of our diseases.
What a guy.
I mean, I'm going to give him this. I think we agree on a couple of things here. We do agree that disease is multifactorial. We do believe that plants are carbs. It is, the energy currency of the cell, glucose. However, I will say here that while refined sugars can indeed contribute to health problems, the scientific evidence is so overwhelmingly shows that populations consuming whole food, plant-based diets have lower rates of chronic diseases. I mean, let's take a look at the populations around the world, right? We're talking about Hindus, Sikhs, Rastafarians, the Itals who don't eat meat and dairy, have lived for ages and eons pretty healthily, I would have to say, in zones like the blue zones, regions with the highest concentration of centenarians. They all feature plant predominant diets, right? Yes, of course, they may have some inclusion of meat and dairy, but it's such a nominal amount that it doesn't have the vast impacts of, say, the standard American diet or what we call the SAD diet. It's high in fiber, rich in fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grain, and of course, like I said, minimal animal-based products. And the thing that I think is the most important that is disease preventative that we talk about with plants is we're talking about the phytochemicals, the antioxidants that exist in plants from flavonoids, carotenoids, right? Beta carotene. And these things are actually protective against disease. And guess what? They're completely absent in animal-based foods.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
I think also that's what I find so frustrating about this whole debate is that I feel like Dr. Kiltz really relies on anecdotal evidence. He doesn't come so much with actual scientific papers and all that stuff. And Simon Hill keeps trying to sort of bring it back and say, but what about the studies? What about these communities that you're talking about, Shabnam? I mean, you've literally just named communities that have been doing this for hundreds of years. And he's like, yeah, but this one person, this thing happened. So therefore it's this. That's so frustrating.
And I love anecdotal evidence. I think it's a powerful storyteller. It's what intrigues people to believe the story, right? To believe the fad, to make it now part of the culture. But this is also where it could be incredibly problematic. This is where we need empirical evidence. We need specific scientific methods that assess what we are doing in the population or in an intervention is actually being tried, tested, and true, because we know that every individual is unique. But when we look at greater populations and the adverse effects that happens to a great amount of people, we need to take a look at that. And we see that when people eat more meat, more saturated fat, more cholesterol, they have more adverse negative health effects like non-communicable diseases, cancers, type 2 diabetes, stroke, heart disease. And these risks can be mitigated by what we eat.
Amen to that. Let's go to the next clip because I want to see how this develops.
I'm sure your position, or at least what I understand, is that saturated fat is not a problem, right?
Animal fat, I believe, is not the cause
Okay.
of disease at all.
Okay.
More people are allergic to plants than they are to animals. We demify animals, which I think we just need to be open. Like, you can eat both. But when you have an illness, or there may be a risk of you getting an inflammatory disorder, like cancer, like heart disease, like strokes, we want to learn more and be able to talk about this in a way that, yes, there are some people that are more allergic to some plants over others. Which are those that are less allergenic? What can you add to that diet that may be able to reduce inflammation even more? And I think adding more fat, animal fat, is really the best one.
Oh my God.
Go on.
Oh my God.
I just want to say, I don't even want to talk about what he's taught. I just want to make a point about his confidence, right? This is a guy who we could analyze. I mean, Shabnam, you're probably going to talk about what he's actually saying, probably going to debunk it because it is nonsense. But he's got this claw thing going on, which I've never seen, but he kind of taps his claw like on the table like that with intense eye contact. And like, I can't even do that when I'm saying the truth. How does this guy do that when he's spouting lies?
We demify animals. Animal fat, I believe, is not the cause of disease at all.
Okay.
Plants, they are the leading cause of disease.
Yeah, that is the other thing that I find so frustrating about all these videos is like, especially like in the carnivore movement, they say it with their whole chest, like 10 toes down, like it's just fact. But that's so confusing for people like general public just watching it, because then they're like, oh, well, he said it and he's obviously really confident he's a doctor, right?
He's a doctor.
It's really confusing for people. And I just find that so dangerous.
It's so much for me to unpack here what he said. He makes a statement that all food allergy, that the toxicity is from plants. However, the FDA, which I know that we all have problems with in the United States, does report in its evidence and studies that 90% of food allergies come from just 8 foods. The top 4 being, are you ready? In order: milk, eggs, fish, and shellfish. I don't know about you, but those don't sound like plants to me. The following 4, however, are tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soybean. So he's already giving false information saying that 100% of allergies come from plants. We debunked that. The evidence shows that is absolutely not true. And another thing that I think is really important is that if you're serving populations, we need to consider that approximately 65% of the global population is lactose intolerant. And that's like including 90% of East Asians, 70% of African Americans, and 75% of Native Americans, so indigenous people, right? And so I think particularly in our work with Greener by Default, we often emphasize to people that approximately 30 to 50 million Americans are lactose intolerant. And the majority of those who are people of color. And so when you're talking about imposing a diet that's good for all, best for all, you're almost saying like, as long as you are white.
Oof.
And that is so incredibly offensive. And in addition, let me talk about how he talks about how animal fat and disease don't exist. Well, how is that even the case? The World Health Organization classifies meat as a what? A level 1 carcinogen.
Yeah.
Processed meat, right? Whereas regular meat could be a 2A carcinogen, meaning that it probably causes some disease. And so I think the biggest thing that Dr. Kiltz doesn't talk about are the chemicals that come with meat. There are, right? We've got heterocycloamines, which basically form at high temperatures when you're cooking or grilling meat, which is what? A known carcinogen. Then we've got N-nitroso compounds or NOCs, which are found in processed meat. And these are formed when you add nitrates and sodium nitrates to preserve the meat itself. That's problematic and can lead to cancer. And then we also have heme iron, right? So this is primarily found in red meat, which can not only damage the intestinal lining, but it could also help in the formation of those carcinogenic compounds. So everything that he's saying is actually debunked by evidence, which is why we think empirical evidence is so important, because we need the research methods to show us that, hey, this impacts multiple populations of people.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing I wanted to bring up and ask you about, Shabnam, is, I mean, I know why he does this, but he uses the term poisonous when referring to plants. And it's just so irritating. It's like you're putting words there. Oh, plants are poisonous. It's like, but what about all the benefits to plants? I mean, obviously he's advocating for a carnivore diet, which would mean no plants at all. But I think that's where Simon Hill tries to jump in and say, what about like the fiber, all the other nutritional benefits, antioxidants, all that stuff, which you're not getting from animal-based foods. So he completely throws that out the window by saying plants are poisonous.
Dr. Kiltz's explanation is that it's plants at the core root of poor metabolic health. And I think it's hard to blame plants that are basically non-existent in the average person's diet, firstly. And so when I look at the current diet right now and say, well, what are the problems with this? The big ticket item is that 70% of calories are coming from ultra-processed foods that are hyperpalatable. They're easy to overconsume because they're low in protein, they're low in water, they're low in fiber. And when you're constantly consuming these foods, it's very difficult to regulate the total amount of calories you're bringing in relative to the amount of calories your body actually needs. So it's very easy to eat in a calorie surplus, and over time your body has to do something with that excess energy, and it begins to store it. It can store it in subcutaneous fat, which is under the skin, and that's relatively benign, not completely, or it can start to go centrally into our organs, into the liver and pancreas, like I mentioned. And that's what I believe is at the core of poor metabolic health.
Simon Hill is my absolute favorite. I mean, even as an exercise physiologist, I feel like he's like the god of exercise physiology. He's just knows so like how to read literature, right? And I think that's the biggest issue is you can cherry pick what a study says, but to adequately be able to read what the study design is, what the methods are, what the results are, and really understanding the graphs and being able to interpret them, I feel like he does such a good job of doing that in a non-biased way that I would have just sat there and been a schoolgirl. And he had significantly more patience than I do, because I think I would have called out Dr. Kiltz.
He did so well. He was very, very calm. Like he just kept, refuting all the points. But I don't know how he kept his cool, because that was intense for 2 hours as well.
Battle lines certainly have been drawn with the carnivore community. And I just want to hear from you, Sarah, because you've kind of explored this community certainly more than me. What's your experience been?
So I actually signed up to a carnivore summit a few months back, and I gave like a fake name and everything. I tried to look back to see what my fake name was. My fake name was Sarah Jean Samuels. Because I was like, I don't want them to catch me, and I used like an old Hotmail or whatever to sign up to it. And it was so interesting. I kind of wanted to go like behind enemy lines, so to speak, to kind of just see like what people were chatting about, what sort of experts they had and stuff. And I think the keynote speaker was Dr. Sean Baker, which I'm sure you guys will know, who's obviously a big advocate for carnivore. But I think what I just found so interesting about it is they're kind of like drinking their own Kool-Aid. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I suppose it's kind of like being at a plant-based summit where everybody's talking about it, but giving like scientific evidence. It's the same thing on the other side. They really believe what they're advocating for, but what I saw was so much just anecdotal stuff. So it's like they might be doctors and they might be, experts in whatever field, but a lot of them are just using examples similar to Dr. Kiltz, where it's just like, well, here's this anecdote that I'm going to give you that then proves it. And like what you were saying, Shabnam, is we can't really use anecdotes on their own. They make up like a really good part of the conversation, but you need vast studies, empirical evidence, like all this kind of stuff to actually give us any sort of insight into the actual truth.
What's the best way to look at the evidence and figure out which one has more weight than others?
My grandmother, we used to eat a lot more fat in our diets and we don't today. A Mediterranean diet is basically a low animal fat diet. And our standard diets we're eating today, yes, there are processed foods, but one of my best friends died of cancer and he ate a very healthy diet. He was a healthy, a strong doctor, very, very exercised a lot, great positivity in life. But when he died, Dave died of cancer. I was like, okay, why did that guy die? And so the evidence is in our conversations and things we share. This is where evidence comes from. It's not a scientific paper that someone gets published to prove things. The government and science and medicine, they're certainly looking for answers, but I hope that each of us can be a little questioning whether or not that's exact. But I would say our stories are one of the most important things we can do.
I have a very different view.
Yeah.
Your anecdote is a really important anecdote. But I think something that I would put out at the beginning of this conversation for us to explore is that there are anecdotes everywhere. That's where I believe the anecdotes are interesting and they're very hypothesis generating, but you need to come back to the science and data. Andrew Reynolds, 2019, performs the largest systematic review of randomized controlled trials, observational studies, and increasing fiber and whole grain intake across the board, unanimous. This is 135 million plus people of follow-up data shows a reduction in risk of colorectal cancer. The more fiber people eat, the more whole grains, the lower their risk of colorectal cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease. Why does that data exist, yet you take a different position?
Colon cancer on the rise in younger people. It's on the rise.
Sure. But there could be many explanations for that other than sugar.
Listen, everything's multifactorial. But the one thing I've learned more than anything, fiber is one of the leading causes of colon cancer, and I will bet $1 billion on this.
It's difficult because we obviously are advocating for whole foods, plant-based and all that kind of stuff. They're on the other side advocating for carnivore. If you're a normal everyday citizen just getting about your life, how are you supposed to know who to listen to? And that's what I find so kind of scary about being at the summit is I was kind of like, okay, they're going hard in on this. They really believe this. And if I wasn't looking into this stuff, looking at studies, all this kind of thing, maybe I believe them. I don't know. It's intriguing.
I mean, I could also argue, to play devil's advocate, that animal advocacy is the same cultish kind of ideology, right? And people who don't understand animal advocacy and the need for welfare and caring for animals and creating a better and just system can walk into one of those conferences and be like, what did I get myself into? Why is this a cult, right?
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of who's seeing that perspective. But I think the difference between the two camps is that empirical evidence, right? For example, in our work at GBD, when we look at the environmental impact, for example, of our diet, 77% of the world's farmland is actually attributed to animal agriculture. And that contributes to 57% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which only produces 37% of the world's protein. So I don't know about you, but that is a terrible return on investment. And so, again, all of that is equated from evidence, from science, from longitudinal studies, multiple studies, meta-analysis that allows us to look at life cycle analysis, to look at our food system just beyond a macronutrient profile. It's just beyond protein. There's so much more to nutrition than just one particular macronutrient. And I think that's the dangers and pitfalls of the carnivore diet that we're finding is we choose to cherry pick on one thing and leave all the other things in absence.
They got bro science. That's all they got, right?
Very bro science.
I saw a TV show in 2019 where the guy was, I think it was Carnivore MD. He was talking about a study. And the interviewer said, where is it published? And he said, well, no, it's currently going through the peer review process.
This was an MD?
Yeah, he's called Carnivore MD. It was in 2020, actually, just before COVID.
He basically came out and said that we don't actually have the scientific evidence. There's no proof to say what will happen to you if you continue this diet, long term. And so he really had to backtrack. And then we showed a video recently, Klaus, of him on PBN, where he was making an animal-based ice cream, which was literally made of watermelon. And everyone was like, what sort of an animal is a watermelon, Paul? I've never seen a watermelon crawling along on four legs. What are you talking about? So
I wonder if he got some interesting health news.
I wonder. But yeah, he basically had to backtrack a bit after being so firm about it. He's now kind of scaled back a little bit and is not full carnivore. So I'm wondering if we might see a little bit of a trend of that happening over the next few years. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.